Hi guys, tonight we step quietly into one of the most haunting and fascinating stories of the Second World War. Imagine flying in a fragile wooden biplane, under the cover of darkness, hunted by searchlights and gunfire, yet feared by the German army. This was the reality of the Soviet Night Witches, a regiment of young women who took to the skies with courage that still stirs the world. Their story is not about machines of steel, but about determination, spirit, and the sound of wings cutting through midnight air. Before we get started, if you enjoy exploring hidden corners of history at a slower pace, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. I'd love to connect with you there. The tale of the Night Witches begins in the summer of 1941, when Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union. The Red Army, unprepared for the scale and ferocity of the assault, faced catastrophic losses in men, equipment, and territory. The Soviet government called upon every possible resource, including women, to join the defense of their homeland. Among those who answered were hundreds of young women who volunteered to become pilots, navigators, and mechanics. Many were barely out of school, their hands more familiar with textbooks than with the controls of an aircraft. Yet within months, they were transformed into aviators entrusted with nighttime bombing missions. The women were organised into the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, later renamed the 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment. Under the leadership of Marina Raskova, a celebrated aviator often called the Soviet Amelia Earhart, the unit was formed with determination and urgency. These women were not given the advanced planes that male regiments used. Instead, they flew the Polikarpov PO-2, an outdated biplane made of wood and canvas, originally designed for training and crop dusting. The plane had no armour, no radio, and carried only 2 bombs at a time, yet its very simplicity would become an advantage. In the darkness, the PO-2 could glide almost silently. German soldiers, hearing only the faint rustle of wings, compared the sound to broomsticks flying overhead, which gave rise to the nickname Night Witches. At first, the women faced skepticism and ridicule, even from their fellow Soviets. Some officers doubted that women could endure the rigours of combat. Others dismissed the regiment as a publicity stunt. But the Night Witches were determined to prove themselves. They endured harsh training, learning to navigate in complete darkness, to fly low over enemy lines, and to release bombs with deadly precision. The cold was brutal. In open cockpits, the winter air froze their skin and stiffened their fingers on the controls. They wrapped themselves in layers of clothing, but frostbite was a constant danger. The biplanes offered no protection from bullets or flak, so survival depended on skill, stealth, and sheer nerve. Missions often lasted through the night, with pilots making multiple trips to drop their limited bomb load. They would land, quickly rearm and take off again, sometimes as many as 8 or 10 times before dawn. Each flight carried the risk of being caught in searchlights, where anti-aircraft guns and German night fighters awaited. Yet the Night Witches pressed on, night after night. Their courage did not go unnoticed. The Germans soon realised that these seemingly fragile planes were causing real damage. Ammunition depots, supply lines, and encampments were destroyed, morale was shaken, and soldiers spoke with dread of the whispering wings in the dark sky. Over time, the Night Witches became both a legend and a tactical problem for the enemy. Within their own ranks, a powerful bond grew. The women supported each other, shared fears, and found strength in sisterhood. They celebrated each safe return and mourned every loss together. Many formed friendships that endured long after the war. What made their story remarkable was not only the danger they faced, but the quiet persistence with which they fought. They did not have the luxury of advanced technology, but they had determination. They did not seek fame, but they earned it, as their regiment became one of the most decorated in the Soviet Air Force. Tonight, as we begin this journey, we step into their world, into the long nights, the sound of engines sputtering to life, the fear of searchlights sweeping across the sky, and the bravery of women who refuse to let war silence them. Their story is not one of despair but of resilience, carried on wings of canvas and wood, lit by courage in the darkest of times. When the regiment was first assembled, most of the women had little more than the basics of flight training. Many were still teenagers, carrying notebooks and pencils in their pockets only months before, and now they were handed flight suits and assigned to fragile biplanes. The transition was not simple. Training was grueling, compressed into weeks rather than years, and demanded that they master navigation, night flying and bombing techniques all at once. They learned to read maps by the dim glow of a flashlight, to calculate angles in their heads, and to trust their instincts when equipment failed. Often, the planes did not even have instruments beyond the simplest gauges. A compass, an altimeter, and their own sense of direction had to be enough. For these women, preparation was both physical and emotional. They had to build strength to handle long nights in the open cockpit, where winds cut through their uniforms and shook their bones. They trained in mechanics too, learning how to change spark plugs, patch bullet holes, and repair torn fabric on the wings. They became their own ground crew, rolling the planes into position, loading bombs and tightening every bolt. There was no special treatment because they were women. In fact, they had to work twice as hard to be taken seriously. Life at the airfield was harsh. The bases were often little more than open fields, muddy strips carved into the countryside. Wooden huts served as barracks, with straw mattresses and thin blankets to keep out the cold. In winter, they slept in layers of clothing, breathing clouds into the dark, and in summer they endured swarms of mosquitoes and dust storms that clung to their skin. Food was simple: bread, soup, sometimes porridge, and always scarce. Yet despite the hardships, morale was high. Each woman carried a personal reason for volunteering. Some had lost brothers, fathers, or husbands to the war and sought to fight back. Others were driven by patriotism, determined to defend their country no matter the risk. And for many there was a sense of proving themselves, not only to men who doubted them, but to history itself. In those early months, mistakes were common. Pilots got lost in the dark, bombs missed their targets, and landings went wrong on rough fields. Yet failure was not an option. Each error became a lesson, each night a chance to improve. Slowly the regiment sharpened its skills until they became a feared precision unit. What gave them an advantage was their discipline and the element of surprise. The Po-2 was slow, with a top speed lower than most German fighters' stall speed, which meant that enemy planes struggled to engage them effectively. At low altitudes, the biplanes could skim across treetops, glide silently toward a target, and release bombs before disappearing back into the night. The women learned to cut their engines mid-flight, letting the plane drift soundlessly until it was too late for the enemy to react. It was dangerous, but it gave them the edge they needed. For the Night Witches, every mission was a test of nerve. As they took off into the darkness, they never knew whether they would return. But together, they learned to trust the rhythm of the night, the hum of the engine, and each other's steady presence in the sky. Their training had turned them from students into warriors, and now the war awaited them. The first real combat missions were unlike anything the women had experienced during training. Their orders were simple in words, but terrifying in reality. Take off under the cover of darkness, fly low into enemy territory, drop bombs on supply depots, camps and positions, then return before dawn. For the young aviators, the night became both a shield and a threat. In the blackness of the sky, they felt invisible, yet they also knew that searchlights could cut across the darkness at any moment and reveal them to the guns waiting below. Each mission began with ritual-like preparation. Mechanics checked the fragile planes, often by lantern light, tightening bolts, filling fuel tanks, and strapping 2 bombs beneath the wings. The pilots and navigators whispered final words to each other, voices steady but eyes betraying fear. The engines coughed to life, sputtering and roaring as the biplanes rolled across rough fields and lifted into the cool night air. Up above, the world felt suspended. The stars stretched endless across the sky. The earth below was a blur of dark forests and rivers, and the only sound was the steady drone of the small engine. To the women, each flight carried a strange mixture of calm and dread. The serenity of the night sky and the knowledge that danger lurked ahead. The Potus were slow, so flights took time. Navigators kept track of the route using maps and stopwatches, marking landmarks barely visible in the moonlight. Often clouds or fog obscured everything, forcing them to rely on instinct. The pilots had to fly low to avoid enemy radar, sometimes so low that treetops seemed to brush the undercarriage. There was no margin for error, no second chances if they lost their way. Approaching the target was always the most dangerous moment. Searchlights swept across the sky like pale fingers, hunting for movement. The women cut their engines, letting the planes glide silently forward. The sudden silence was eerie, no sound but the rush of air past the wings, until the navigator whispered the signal and the bombs were released. Explosions lit the night, and almost instantly the searchlights converged. The air erupted with flak bursts of fire clawing at the sky. The pilots had to restart their engines, bank sharply, and dive away before enemy fire caught them. Many times tracer rounds streaked so close they could feel the heat, yet somehow they slipped back into the shadows. On returning to base, there was no time for celebration. The planes landed, bombs were reloaded, fuel topped off, and the crews took off again, sometimes flying up to 10 missions in one night. Exhaustion pressed heavily on them, but adrenaline kept them moving. Each mission was a small act of defiance, a way of proving that even outdated planes flown by young women could strike fear into one of the most powerful armies in the world. As dawn approached, they finally returned to their huts, faces pale with fatigue, hands stiff from cold, and eyes heavy with sleeplessness. Yet inside their hearts was the quiet knowledge that they had done their duty. For the Night Witches, these first missions marked the beginning of a long, relentless rhythm. Night after night, a dance of courage against overwhelming odds. By the time autumn of 1942 arrived, the regiment had already begun to make a name for itself along the front. What had once been a group of inexperienced recruits was now a unit seasoned by nights of fire and fear. The women adjusted to the endless rhythm of missions, learning to live in the twilight between exhaustion and vigilance. They developed small routines to steady their nerves, braiding each other's hair before takeoff, whispering jokes in the freezing dark, or holding Lucky Charms in their pockets. These quiet rituals offered comfort against the constant reminder that each mission could be their last. Life on the ground was just as challenging as life in the air. The regiment's bases shifted often, sometimes only rough clearings carved out near villages destroyed by the war. The women slept in cramped huts or makeshift tents, with frost on their blankets in winter and mud clinging to everything in spring. Nights without missions were rare, but when they came, the women gathered around candles, writing letters to families or sketching small pictures in notebooks. They spoke softly about home, though many no longer had one to return to. Supplies were always scarce. Uniforms were often oversized, handed down from male soldiers, with belts wrapped twice around slender waists and boots stuffed with rags to keep them from slipping off. Gloves were mismatched, jackets threadbare, yet the women made do, patching holes and sharing what little they had. Hunger was a constant companion. Meals limited to black bread, cabbage soup, and sometimes a piece of dried fish. Still, they smiled when they could, taking strength from each other more than from the food. Despite hardships, the regiment's effectiveness grew. They perfected their tactics, often flying in groups of 3. The first 2 planes would draw enemy searchlights and gunfire, zigzagging to confuse defences. The third, flying behind with engines cut, would glide silently and release its bombs on target. Then, the planes switched roles, circling back until the mission was complete. It was teamwork at its most dangerous, each woman relying on the others for survival. Stories of their exploits began to spread, and with them came the legend of the Night Witches. German soldiers, unnerved by the sudden silence before bombs fell, feared the whisper of wings in the night. Some believed the women possessed supernatural powers, able to see in the dark or vanish into the sky. The nickname, meant as an insult, became a badge of honour for the regiment. Yet behind the legend were young women who still felt fear, who still shook before each mission. They wrote in diaries about trembling hands and racing hearts, about forcing themselves to climb back into the cockpit after barely surviving the last flight. Their courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to fly despite it. By the end of that year, the Night Witches had already completed thousands of sorties. Each one was a small stroke in a larger picture, proving to their comrades, their country, and themselves that determination could outfly even the most daunting of odds. They were no longer simply girls in borrowed uniforms. They were aviators of war, woven into the very fabric of the Soviet defence. The winter of 1942-43 tested the regiment more than ever before. The cold crept into every corner of their lives, turning simple tasks into struggles. Engines froze on the airfield, oil thickened like glue, and mechanics had to heat parts with open flames just to prepare the planes for flight. The women dressed in layers of wool, wrapping scarves around their faces until only their eyes showed. Yet the cold bit through everything. In the open cockpit, the wind was merciless, freezing tears before they fell and numbing fingers until it was painful to move the controls. Frostbite became a constant threat, and many returned from missions with raw skin or blistered hands. Despite these hardships, the regiment's missions increased. The Germans were dug in, building strong defences along key positions, and the Night Witches were tasked with disrupting supply lines and striking at ammunition depots hidden in forests. Each night they flew sortie after sortie, guided only by the stars and the faint glow of the horizon. The silence of gliding toward a target in sub-zero air felt sharper than ever. The sound of bombs falling swallowed by the wind. Each landing on frozen fields was dangerous. Wheels skidded, brakes stuck, and more than once planes tipped into snowdrifts. The women laughed at these mishaps when no one was hurt, but the truth was that every flight carried risks that multiplied in winter. What kept them going was their bond. They shared everything: mittens, blankets, even stories whispered under heavy coats as they huddled near a small stove. Songs and jokes softened the edge of fear, and sometimes they danced briefly on frozen ground just to keep blood moving in their legs. Their resilience was more than endurance. It was a way of resisting despair. Recognition from their superiors began to grow. Though still not given modern equipment, the regiment earned respect for its efficiency. Reports from the front showed German soldiers delaying supply runs until daylight, out of fear of nighttime raids. Each successful mission proved that even in the harshest winter, the Night Witches could not be silenced. For the women, this was more than war. It was survival, identity, and a promise to each other that no amount of cold, hunger, or danger would keep them from the sky. By the spring of 1943, the regiment had become a vital force along the front, trusted to strike where the enemy least expected. Each mission demanded not only bravery, but sharp coordination between pilots and navigators. In their small cockpits, they learned to communicate with the briefest gestures or a single word. A nod meant it was time to cut the engine. A tap on the arm signalled the moment to release bombs. These simple signals carried lives within them, for hesitation could mean the difference between slipping unseen into the night or being caught in a deadly beam of light. The Po-2 biplanes remained both a curse and a blessing. They were fragile, so fragile that bullets could easily tear through their wooden frames, yet that very fragility gave them an edge. German fighters flew too fast to track the slow-moving biplanes without overshooting, and anti-aircraft guns found it difficult to predict their unpredictable glides. Still, this advantage did not erase the constant fear of being struck mid-air. Many women recalled the sharp rattle of flak exploding nearby, the sudden lurch of their plane as shrapnel ripped holes through canvas, and the terrifying silence when engines stalled at the worst moment. Ground crews became silent heroes. Each night, mechanics, often women themselves, worked in darkness, fingers numb from cold, patching torn wings and checking every bolt. They carried the same weight of responsibility as the crews in the air, knowing that a missed detail could cost lives. Pilots trusted them completely, a bond formed not by words but by the certainty that each plane was handed back as ready as possible. Beyond the missions, the women found ways to preserve fragments of normal life. They wrote poetry in notebooks, sketched the outlines of villages they flew over, and shared photographs of loved ones back home. Some even embroidered small patterns on their flight scarves, tiny pieces of beauty hidden in the brutality of war. These moments reminded them of who they were beyond their roles as soldiers. Loss, however, was a shadow that never disappeared. Planes did not always return. When a crew failed to land by dawn, silence hung heavy across the camp. Friends folded blankets that would no longer be needed, and comrades carried on, flying again that same night despite the ache in their hearts. There was no time to grieve fully. Survival demanded movement, and the sky demanded its due. By mid-1943, the regiment's reputation had spread far beyond their sector. Soviet commanders praised their effectiveness, and German soldiers dreaded the whisper of wings in the dark. For the women themselves, every mission was both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary because it had become their nightly rhythm, extraordinary because each return to the ground was a small miracle. By the summer of 1943, the regiment was thrust into one of the most decisive battles of the war, Kursk. It was here, amid the roar of tanks and the thunder of artillery, that the Night Witches played a crucial supporting role. Their task was not glamorous, it was relentless. Night after night, they flew into the teeth of the German defences, targeting supply convoys, artillery positions and fuel depots. While the great clash of armour raged by day, the skies belonged to the women when darkness fell. The missions at Kursk demanded everything they had. The enemy was ready for them, filling the night with searchlights and layered walls of flak. Entire sectors of the sky shimmered with exploding shells, each burst a reminder of how thin the line was between life and death. The Potus weaved and dipped, gliding low, engines cut, before releasing their bombs and darting away. Sometimes the planes came back peppered with holes, fabric shredded, struts weakened, yet the crews pushed them back into the air as soon as repairs could be made. The intensity of the battle left little room for rest. Pilots often flew 6 or 7 sorties in one night, their faces drawn with fatigue, their eyes bloodshot from staring into darkness for hours. Sleep was a rare luxury, snatched in short bursts between missions, boots still on, uniform still smelling of smoke and fuel. Food became less important than warmth, and many ate only enough to stay upright. Despite exhaustion, the women's determination never wavered. They knew their missions disrupted German logistics, slowing fuel and ammunition from reaching the front lines. Soldiers on the ground later recalled the relief of hearing bombs fall in the enemy's rear, proof that the Night Witches were keeping pressure on the other side of the battlefield. Losses mounted, however. The battlefield at Kursk was unforgiving, and not every plane returned. Each absence cut deeply, but the regiment pressed forward, driven by duty and memory of their fallen. They learned to honour their comrades not with long ceremonies but with silence, a few quiet words, and the resolve to fly again. The legend of the Night Witches grew stronger here. German prisoners spoke of the eerie dread they felt when the faint hiss of wings brushed across the night, a sound that meant fire and destruction would follow. Some refused to light cigarettes at night, fearing the glow would guide an unseen pilot to their position. The very mention of the regiment unsettled troops hardened by years of fighting. For the women themselves, the Battle of Kursk was a crucible. It proved that they were not only participants in the war, but vital to its course. They returned to their bases weary, battered but unbroken, their courage written not in medals but in the simple act of climbing back into their cockpits night after night. After Kursk, the regiment was redeployed to support offensives pushing westward. Each new campaign brought longer flights, unfamiliar terrain, and different dangers. The front was moving, and the Night Witches moved with it, establishing makeshift bases closer to advancing troops. Sometimes they arrived at a location only hours after it had been cleared of enemy forces, the ground still littered with shell craters and wreckage. Life at these forward bases was harsh even by their standards. Barracks were little more than wooden shacks or tents pitched in muddy fields. Supplies were scarce, and the women often scavenged for boards, straw, or discarded fuel drums to improve living conditions. They cooked over open fires when they could, ate quickly, and returned to their work. The war allowed no pause, and the nights demanded their presence in the sky. Missions now took them deeper into enemy territory, often requiring precise navigation across rivers, forests, and unfamiliar villages. The further west they flew, the more dangerous their flights became. German defences adapted, and searchlights multiplied. Anti-aircraft batteries were placed in layers, creating deadly traps for low-flying planes. The women responded with new tactics, flying in staggered waves, splitting formations to confuse defences, and gliding silently from unexpected directions. Each sortie demanded imagination as much as skill. By this time, camaraderie had become the regiment's greatest strength. The women depended on one another completely, not only in the air but on the ground. Mechanics worked side by side with pilots, often repairing planes through the night without rest. Navigators checked each other's maps, correcting small errors that could cost lives. Friendships deepened into bonds stronger than family, for only those who lived through the same nights could understand the weight of them. Letters home remained a lifeline. Some wrote to parents, others to brothers at the front, and a few to sweethearts who waited far away. Yet many never spoke of the dangers they faced, choosing instead to describe sunsets, the sound of rain on canvas tents, or the laughter shared over weak tea. These words carried fragments of normal life into a world where normality no longer existed. Recognition grew as well. Soviet commanders praised their precision, awarding medals to crews for extraordinary bravery. Yet the women themselves often shrugged at the honours. To them, each mission was simply part of their duty, another night to endure, another flight to survive. Medals could not warm frozen fingers or ease the ache of losing a comrade, but they reminded them that their work mattered, that their sacrifices were seen. By late 1943, the regiment had flown thousands of missions, wearing down the enemy's strength one small strike at a time. Each woman knew the cost, but they also knew the meaning. Every night they flew was another step closer to victory, another reminder that even fragile wings could carry the weight of war. By the winter of 1943, the regiment had become a symbol as much as a fighting force. Their name spread across the Soviet Union, appearing in newspapers and whispered in villages. Families spoke of the witches who haunted the night sky, and children imagined them as heroes with wings of fire. For the women themselves, such stories felt distant. They did not see themselves as legends, but as tired soldiers who still faced cold winds, long nights, and the unending demand to fly again. The truth of their existence was far harsher than the image. That winter was among the coldest they had endured. Snowstorms buried airstrips, forcing mechanics to clear runways with shovels before dawn. Engines struggled to start, and frostbite threatened anyone who worked outside for long. The women wrapped themselves in layer after layer, but nothing could stop the bitter sting of wind once they climbed into their open cockpits. Missions stretched on despite the weather. The regiment targeted rail lines, bridges, and enemy supply depots, striking in areas where German forces were weakest in winter preparation. Each successful mission carried the satisfaction of disrupting the enemy's flow of men and equipment, but each also carried the weight of survival against brutal odds. Even simple landings became trials. Wheels skidded on ice, planes slid off makeshift runways, and sometimes a crash meant the loss of both aircraft and crew. The women learned to hide their fear behind calm expressions. They joked about frozen bread that had to be cut with axes, about boots that cracked in the cold, about the constant mud that clung to everything in spring. Laughter became a shield, a way to remind themselves that they were still human, still capable of joy amid hardship. In quieter moments they found solace in small acts. Some knitted socks from scraps of yarn, others drew pictures in the margins of maps, and a few sang softly before missions. These gestures did not erase the exhaustion, but they gave meaning to nights filled with danger. Losses continued, and with each absence the regiment carried the memory forward. There was no time to mourn deeply, yet each woman who did not return was remembered in whispered prayers or a quiet glance at an empty bunk. Survival became not only about skill, but about carrying the weight of those who could no longer fly. The Germans, meanwhile, feared them more than ever. Stories spread among troops of silent planes that appeared without warning, dropping bombs before vanishing into the dark. Soldiers described the eerie hiss of gliding wings as if the night itself carried claws. Some even claimed the women had potions or charms that made them invisible. Such tales amused the regiment, but they also revealed the truth. The night witches had become a psychological weapon as well as a physical one. By the end of that year, the women knew their role was more than tactical. They were proof that resilience could become legend, that determination could turn fragile planes into instruments of fear, and that courage could outlast the longest winter nights. The year 1944 brought with it both hope and heavier responsibilities. The Soviet advance was accelerating, pushing the German army westward, and the Night Witches followed this movement closely. Their missions expanded in scale, with targets stretching farther behind enemy lines. Bridges, depots, and troop concentrations became constant objectives, and the pressure to deliver precise strikes grew with every passing night. Each sortie now lasted longer, sometimes requiring hours in the cold cockpit, guided only by the dim outlines of rivers and forests below. The pilots and navigators developed an almost instinctive sense of direction, able to find their way in total darkness, with little more than the North Star and the ticking of a stopwatch. These extended missions demanded extraordinary stamina. Crews often took off at dusk and returned near dawn, landing only long enough to refuel and reload before taking off again. Fatigue settled deeply into their bodies, yet they moved with mechanical efficiency, driven by duty. Meals were hurried, sometimes nothing more than bread and tea, and sleep came in snatches between sorties. They learned to rest with helmets still on, curled against walls or lying on blankets spread across the frozen ground. The strain showed in their faces, but their spirit endured. With each mission, their reputation deepened. German soldiers began to call them the unseen enemy, dreading the whisper of gliding wings overhead. Some refused to camp in open areas at night, fearing the sudden arrival of bombs. Others believed these women had an unnatural ability to see in the dark, and rumours spread faster than the truth. For the Night Witches, these myths were strange comforts. They reminded them that even with fragile planes, they had become a force capable of shaping fear. Still, the war was not without heavy costs. Losses mounted as defences tightened. New German night fighters prowled the skies, and flak batteries grew more accurate. Some planes failed to return, leaving empty bunks behind. Each loss was felt deeply, yet the women honoured their fallen comrades by continuing to fly, by carrying the mission forward as if guided by unseen hands. Camaraderie grew stronger than ever. They braided each other's hair before missions, exchanged small notes, and whispered encouragements as engines sputtered to life. These gestures, so small, carried immense meaning, reminding them that they were never alone. They found resilience in each other's presence, courage in shared silence, and strength in the knowledge that their efforts were part of something larger than themselves. By mid-1944, the regiment had flown tens of thousands of missions, each one a thread woven into the larger tapestry of the war. They were not just supporting the Soviet advance, they were becoming part of the reason it succeeded. For the women in their canvas and wood biplanes, the nights stretched endlessly, but each dawn they returned carried a quiet triumph. Another night survived, another step closer to victory. By the summer of 1944, the regiment's missions carried them into territories once thought unreachable. As Soviet forces crossed into Eastern Europe, the Night Witches followed, flying over landscapes they had never seen before, rolling fields, dense forests, and towns scarred by years of occupation. For many of the women, these flights were the first time they'd glimpsed lands beyond their own country. Yet the beauty of these places was always shadowed by the smoke of war. The further west they flew, the stronger the enemy's defences became. Searchlights crisscrossed the skies in greater numbers, weaving nets of light that threatened to catch their fragile planes. The women developed new tactics, sometimes cutting engines miles before a target to glide silently past the beams. It was a terrifying manoeuvre, for silence meant vulnerability, but it also gave them the element of surprise. Many described the eerie stillness of those moments, the way the stars seemed louder than the wind, until the sudden roar of the engine broke the night again. Fatigue weighed heavily on the regiment. Missions now stretched across longer distances, and with each sortie they carried not only bombs but the weight of memory. They had lost friends along the way, and the war showed no sign of ending soon. Yet the women found ways to keep going. They painted small symbols on their planes, stars, flowers, even birds, to mark their individuality amid the uniform grey of war. Some carried talismans, a ribbon tied to the cockpit, a lucky coin tucked in a boot. These tokens became anchors, reminders of home and identity in a world that tried to erase both. On the ground, camaraderie remained their lifeline. Evenings before missions were filled with laughter, teasing, and quiet confessions whispered in the dark. They shared secrets about childhood, dreams for the future, and hopes for what they would do after the war. Some longed to return to school, others dreamed of teaching, and a few imagined themselves continuing to fly in a world finally at peace. The legends around them grew, not only among the enemy but within their own ranks. Fellow Soviet soldiers spoke of them with admiration, marvelling at how fragile planes could survive in skies dominated by faster, stronger machines. To the women, the praise felt unreal, for they knew the exhaustion, the fear, and the fragility behind the myth. Yet they accepted it with quiet pride, knowing that their work mattered. By late summer, their missions helped pave the way for advancing Soviet armies, disrupting German reinforcements and cutting off vital supplies. Every bomb they dropped echoed far beyond its explosion, contributing to the larger rhythm of the war. Though they often returned with frostbitten hands, weary eyes, and planes riddled with holes, they carried within them a calm certainty that even the smallest wings flown with courage could help turn the tide of history. As autumn 1944 unfolded, the regiment pressed deeper into hostile skies. The Soviet advance now pushed into Poland, and the Night Witches found themselves flying missions above towns and villages that bore the scars of years under German occupation. Each sortie carried them farther from their familiar bases, demanding precision in navigation and endurance against longer hours in the cockpit. Maps grew more complex, and the darkness felt thicker in unfamiliar terrain. Still, the women adapted, guiding their planes by rivers, rail lines, and the faint glimmers of ruined towns below. With every mile westward, the enemy's resistance hardened. German anti-aircraft fire intensified, shells bursting in patterns designed to trap slow-moving biplanes. To survive, the women flew lower than ever before, skimming treetops and rooftops, sometimes so close they could see the flicker of firelight in windows. The danger was immense, yet flying low offered a strange reassurance. They were hidden by the very earth they sought to defend. Night after night they refined their tactics. Crews often worked in pairs, one distracting defences while the other released bombs. Silent glides became second nature. The sudden hush of the engine felt less like fear and more like a trusted rhythm, a step in a dance rehearsed endlessly under the stars. In those moments the women learned to trust not only their instruments but their instincts, feeling the currents of the air as if the sky itself guided them. Life on the ground remained stark. Their bases were temporary, sometimes no more than fields marked by lanterns and guarded by sentries. They slept on straw or in bunks patched together from scavenged wood, their blankets too thin for the chill that crept into every corner. Yet they created warmth in other ways. They sang quietly before missions, shared stories of childhood winters, and passed around photographs worn soft by touch. These small rituals stitched humanity into nights dominated by war. Letters from home arrived irregularly, but when they did, they were read aloud to friends, turning one person's words into comfort for many. The thought of family waiting somewhere beyond the horizon gave strength when exhaustion threatened to overcome them. By late 1944, the regiment had flown tens of thousands of sorties, earning respect from commanders and admiration from the soldiers they supported. To the women, however, numbers meant little. What mattered was the steady rhythm of survival, the knowledge that they had carried out their duty once again, that they had returned to see another dawn. Their legend grew larger, but within their hearts, they remained the same. Young women in fragile planes, bound together by courage, carrying hope through the darkest hours of the war. The first weeks of 1945 brought with them a sense of both exhaustion and anticipation. The night witches had flown for years without pause, and their bodies carried the weight of sleepless nights, bitter cold, and constant strain. Yet whispers of an approaching victory gave them renewed determination. They knew the war was entering its final phase, but they also understood that the most dangerous missions often came at the very end. The Germans, though retreating, fought with desperation, and every mile gained westward came at heavy cost. For the regiment, winter bases were set up in battered fields of Poland. Snow covered everything, muffling the world in silence broken only by the crackle of distant artillery. The women worked in this icy stillness, preparing planes, checking maps, and wrapping themselves in layer after layer before stepping into the night sky once more. Engines groaned in the cold, sometimes refusing to start until mechanics warmed them with open flames. Frost clung to wings, and breath froze on scarves, yet nothing halted the rhythm of missions. Flights now carried them over long stretches of forest and ruined towns, targeting rail yards, troop concentrations and defensive strongholds. The danger grew sharper with every mission. German defences adapted, layering searchlights and concentrating flak around key positions. To counter this, the women relied more than ever on surprise and deception. They flew in groups, weaving patterns to confuse gunners, or split apart to strike from unexpected angles. Silent glides became even riskier, for the enemy was prepared. But the night witches trusted in their experience, in the instincts honed through thousands of sorties. On the ground, life felt both heavier and lighter. Heavier because losses continued. Friends who had survived years of war were sometimes taken in its final months. Lighter because the horizon of peace finally felt visible, a thought that carried them through exhaustion. They spoke often of what they would do afterward: return to studies, become teachers, or remain in aviation. Some admitted they could not imagine life without flying, while others longed only for quiet days without the sound of engines. Despite dreams of the future, the present demanded all their focus. The winter of 1945 tested their endurance as much as any battle before, but within the regiment, the same spirit remained unbroken. They were bound by shared sacrifice, by nights spent together under stars and gunfire, by the knowledge that their fragile planes had carried them through where no one believed they could. As the Soviet army pushed toward Germany, the night witches prepared themselves for what lay ahead, knowing the last steps of the journey would be the hardest. As the Red Army pressed toward the Oder River in early 1945, the night witches followed closely, carrying out missions that directly supported the final drive into Germany. The pace was relentless. Almost every night brought new targets: supply depots, bridges, artillery positions, and columns of retreating troops. The women launched sortie after sortie, often flying until their bodies trembled with fatigue. Yet each time dawn approached, they prepared again, ready to return to the skies once darkness fell. The conditions grew more complex. Longer distances meant greater risks of becoming lost in unfamiliar territory, especially with landmarks destroyed by constant bombardment. Navigators relied on rivers and rail lines, sometimes just faint glimmers beneath the moonlight. Pilots trusted their instincts more than instruments, banking low over treetops and rooftops as they crept toward their objectives. The enemy knew they were coming. Searchlights now covered every major crossing in town, and German gunners fired with desperate accuracy. Flak bursts filled the night sky like jagged flowers of fire. To survive, the women relied on daring tactics, sudden dives into valleys, sharp turns that brushed treetops, and the eerie silence of cutting their engines to glide unseen. For those moments of silence, hearts beat louder than propellers, every second stretching like an eternity until the bombs were released and engines roared back to life. On the ground, life blurred into routine. Bases shifted constantly, sometimes a little more than frozen fields where tents flapped in icy winds. The women ate whatever rations were available: black bread, thin soup, a piece of dried fish when lucky, and warmed themselves by fires that burned low for lack of fuel. Yet they found ways to hold on to fragments of joy. They celebrated birthdays with songs, scribbled poems in the margins of maps, and shared small treasures like candy or a bar of soap. These simple gifts, passed from one hand to another, carried more value than medals. Losses, however, never stopped haunting them. Empty bunks reminded everyone of the price they paid. Each absence was met with silence, a few tears, and then the unspoken vow to continue flying. They did not dwell on fear, for there was no time. Survival meant looking forward, trusting that courage would carry them through another night. Recognition from commanders grew louder, but the women themselves remained humble. To them, their service was not about glory, but about duty, about protecting the soldiers who advanced on the ground, about helping push the war toward its end. Their fragile planes might have looked like relics, but the impact they delivered was undeniable. By the spring of 1945, the regiment had flown tens of thousands of sorties. Each flight, each bomb dropped, each return to base was another stitch in the fabric of victory. For the women of the Night Witches, the journey was not over yet, but they knew they were flying into the final chapters of the war, carrying both exhaustion and hope on their wings. By the spring of 1945, the advance into Germany demanded every ounce of strength the Night Witches had left. The regiment now flew missions over enemy territory that was defended with ferocity, as German troops fought to hold every bridge and town. For the women, each night meant longer flights across unfamiliar land, deeper into danger, with the knowledge that the war's end was near but not yet within reach. The air felt different now, colder not just from weather, but from the sharp awareness that the last battles could still take their lives. The missions were unrelenting. Crews flew over the Oder, striking supply lines that fed German defences, destroying warehouses and disrupting rail traffic. They often launched 10 sorties in one night, circling back again and again until exhaustion blurred their vision. Some landed barely able to climb from their cockpits, hands frozen stiff on the controls, faces pale from hours in the wind. Yet before long, engines sputtered to life once more, and they returned to the skies. German defences responded with desperation. Searchlights grew thicker, flak more intense, and night fighters hunted the fragile biplanes with lethal precision. The Night Witches adapted with cunning. They flew lower than ever, brushing treetops and skimming rivers to avoid detection. Some missions were coordinated so that one plane drew fire while another struck silently from the shadows. It was dangerous beyond measure, but the regiment had learned to turn danger into survival through teamwork and trust. On the ground, life remained stark. Their bases were makeshift clearings, mud fields littered with frozen puddles. They slept on straw or thin mattresses, sometimes still in their flight suits, too tired to change. Food was scarce, and warmth was rare, but they created comfort through companionship. They laughed around small fires, told stories of childhood, and made promises about the lives they would build when the war ended. These moments gave them strength, as essential as the fuel poured into their planes. Losses weighed heavily in these final months. Each pilot or navigator who did not return left behind not only an empty bunk, but a silence that pressed on every heart. Yet grief could not ground them. They honoured their comrades in the only way they knew, by continuing to fly, carrying the memory of those lost into every mission. Recognition from Soviet commanders grew stronger, and medals were awarded with increasing frequency. But the women cared little for awards. To them, the truest honour was the bond they shared, the knowledge that they had stood together in the darkest nights and carried their fragile planes into skies that seemed impossible to survive. By April, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, the regiment prepared itself for the final chapter. They had flown tens of thousands of sorties, struck countless targets, and endured losses few could imagine. What kept them going was not fame nor glory, but the simple, unshakable truth that their courage mattered. The war was ending, and they would see it through to the very last night. As April 1945 unfolded, the regiment found itself on the edge of history. The Red Army was closing in on Berlin, and every night the Night Witches flew missions that cut deeper into the collapsing German lines. Their targets were no longer distant supply depots, but positions just behind the front, ammunition stockpiles, and retreating columns that clogged narrow roads. Each mission carried a new urgency, for the women knew the end of the war was near, though it demanded every last ounce of their strength. The skies above Germany were more dangerous than ever. Searchlights were arranged in massive grids, their beams sweeping across the horizon in coordinated arcs. The women flew straight into these traps, cutting engines at the last moment, gliding silently through and dropping bombs with precision. The air thundered with flak bursts, fiery blossoms tearing holes in the night. Pilots described the strange calm of watching the sky shatter around them, focusing only on holding their fragile planes steady until the danger passed. Exhaustion pressed down like never before. The crews had flown thousands of missions, and the rhythm of constant takeoffs and landings had eroded their strength. Hands blistered, backs ached, and eyes burned from lack of sleep. Still, when night came, they pulled on heavy coats, tightened scarves, and climbed back into the cockpits. For them, stopping was never an option. The war would not end until Berlin itself was taken. Their bases now were little more than temporary strips close behind the advancing troops. Barracks were overcrowded, meals rushed, and every sound carried reminders of the front. Distant artillery, the hum of tanks, the rumble of trucks. Yet in these rough conditions, the women found ways to keep their humanity intact. They exchanged small gifts, like a scrap of chocolate or a borrowed pencil. They whispered to each other before missions, promises to return, and sometimes sang softly as they walked to their planes. These gestures, fragile yet powerful, gave them the strength to face another night. Losses continued to sting. Even so close to victory, the dangers never faded. Every empty bunk reminded them that peace would come at a price. Still they carried on, guided by the belief that each mission brought the war closer to its conclusion. The Germans feared them until the very end. Reports from prisoners spoke of soldiers dreading the faint whisper of wings above, the omen of bombs falling without warning. The legend of the Night Witches had grown so deeply into the psyche of the enemy that even in retreat, their presence in the skies unsettled hardened troops. By late April, the regiment had become a symbol of relentless persistence. Their planes, patched and battered, had carried them across vast distances, through winters, storms, and fire. And now, as Berlin loomed on the horizon, the women prepared for the last chapter of their war, carrying with them not only bombs but years of courage, sacrifice, and sisterhood written into every flight. In the final days of April 1945, the Night Witches flew their last missions against a collapsing enemy. Berlin was under siege, and the regiment's orders focused on cutting off supplies and isolating the city. Their fragile Po-2 biplanes, which had carried them through years of war, still lifted into the night sky, engines sputtering against the roar of history. Every flight was filled with tension, for the women knew the end was close but not yet secured. One mistake, one burst of flak could still take their lives even in the war's final hours. The atmosphere at their forward bases reflected both exhaustion and anticipation. Pilots and navigators moved with mechanical precision, their bodies worn but their determination sharper than ever. Mechanics patched holes in wings that seemed to multiply with each mission, while others fueled planes in the dim glow of lanterns. The smell of oil and smoke mixed with the chill of spring nights, creating a rhythm that felt eternal. Yet the women spoke often of what awaited them after the fighting ended. Around campfires they dreamed aloud of returning to schools, of reuniting with families, of walking through fields without fear of bombs above. These conversations gave their flights an added weight. Every mission flown now was a step toward those longed-for moments of peace. The Germans, though weakened, did not surrender easily. Searchlights still swept the skies, flak still burst with deadly force, and night fighters still prowled. The Night Witches countered with the same tactics they had used since the beginning: silent glides, sudden dives, and teamwork that confused defences. Years of experience sharpened every movement. They no longer needed to think about each manoeuvre. Their bodies carried the knowledge instinctively. Losses still came, and each one struck deeply. To lose a comrade so close to victory felt cruel beyond words, yet the regiment carried on, honouring the fallen by continuing the mission. Silence became their way of mourning. No speeches, no ceremonies, only the steady act of flying into the night once more. Recognition reached new heights during this period. Soviet commanders openly praised the regiment's bravery, and medals were awarded to many. But among the women, the truest honour was surviving another night together, sharing bread at dawn, and knowing their courage had not been wasted. By the last week of April, the Night Witches had flown more than 23,000 sorties across the war. Their planes bore the scars of countless battles, but their spirits carried the pride of having stood unbroken. With Berlin under siege and the end of the war at hand, they prepared for the final missions, knowing that their place in history was already secured, not as witches, but as women whose fragile wings had carried the weight of victory. The first days of May 1945 brought a strange mix of urgency and quiet expectation. The Night Witches still flew sorties, even as the German front crumbled and Soviet forces closed in on Berlin itself. Their missions targeted the last strongholds, retreating convoys, scattered ammunition dumps, and defensive positions clinging to survival. Each flight felt heavier than before, not because of fatigue alone, but because the women knew these would be among their last. Every takeoff carried the thought, soon the sky would no longer belong to war. The nights were shorter now, spring light creeping in earlier, making their flights more dangerous. Dawn sometimes caught them still in the air, vulnerable to enemy fire. Yet they pressed on, driven by duty and the need to see the war through to its end. The familiar rituals remained unchanged. Mechanics tightening bolts by lantern light, navigators tracing maps with worn pencils, pilots checking engines with numb fingers. These tasks, repeated thousands of times, now carried a sense of farewell, as if each action marked the closing of a long, relentless chapter. Around the camp, conversation shifted. Women spoke more about the future than about the night's targets. Some dreamed of returning to their studies, of walking through city streets without fear. Others wanted to reunite with families they had not seen in years, uncertain if their loved ones had survived. A few admitted they could not imagine life without flying, their identities now inseparable from the fragile planes that had carried them across so many dark skies. The Germans still fought with desperation, and danger remained real until the very end. Flak batteries fired blindly into the night, and stray shells sometimes found their mark. Each time a plane failed to return, grief cut sharply. a cruel reminder that the war could still claim lives even in its final moments. The regiment mourned quietly, as they always had before resuming their missions. By now, their reputation was legendary. German soldiers, exhausted and beaten, still dreaded the faint hiss of wings that meant bombs would soon fall. Among Soviet troops, the Night Witches were spoken of with admiration, their persistence a symbol of resilience in a war defined by suffering. For the women themselves, there was no sense of grandeur. They saw only the tired faces of comrades, the patched plains waiting in the fields, and the endless rhythm of night missions. Yet within them, a quiet pride grew stronger. They had taken fragile machines of wood and canvas and turned them into weapons feared across Europe. As the days ticked toward the final surrender, the regiment prepared for what might be their last missions. The sky had been their battleground, their refuge, and their burden. Soon it would belong again to peace. But for now, as engines coughed to life and bombs were loaded, they carried on, knowing that their wings had helped carry a war toward its end. On May 8, 1945, the long-awaited news reached the regiment. Germany had surrendered. For the Night Witches, it was a moment that felt unreal. After years of flying through darkness, of hearing engines sputter against freezing winds, of watching flak bloom like fire in the sky, the war was finally over. The women gathered in their camp, listening to the announcement, their faces a mixture of relief, disbelief, and quiet sorrow. Victory was real, yet it carried with it the weight of memory, of comrades who had not lived to see this day. Some women wept openly, their tears carrying both joy and grief. Others sat in silence, staring at the fragile planes that had carried them through so much. The Po-2 biplanes, patched and scarred, seemed to embody their own journey. Delicate, underestimated, but unbroken. For the first time in years, the night sky was free of mission orders. No bombs were strapped beneath the wings, no maps spread across cockpits. The silence felt strange, almost heavy. Some of the women admitted they could not sleep, their bodies too accustomed to the rhythm of takeoff and landing. They walked the airfields instead, touching the planes as if saying farewell to companions that had been more than machines. Celebrations among the troops erupted around them, bonfires, songs, embraces, but the regiment's joy was quieter. They celebrated by gathering together, sharing bread and tea, speaking of what the future might hold. They imagined returning to studies, to families, to lives paused by war. Yet beneath every dream was the unspoken acknowledgement that they would never be the same. The war had changed them, reshaped them, given them strength and scars in equal measure. Recognition soon followed. The regiment was honoured as one of the most decorated in the Soviet Air Force. Many of its members received medals for bravery, and their commander spoke proudly of their role in the victory. Yet the women themselves often shrugged at the glory. They saw their service not as legend, but as necessity, as something that had to be done when their country called. To them, the truest reward was survival, the knowledge that they had endured and that their courage had mattered. That night, with no missions to fly, they sat beneath the stars in rare stillness. For the first time in years, the sky above them belonged not to war, but to peace. They looked upward, feeling both the weight of all they had endured and the fragile hope of what lay ahead. The war was over, but their story, woven into history by thousands of silent flights, would live on. When the silence of peace finally settled over Europe, the Night Witches faced a new challenge, returning to a life without war. For years their nights had been filled with missions, their days with preparation, and their thoughts with survival. Now, the routine that had carried them through danger was gone, replaced by uncertainty. Some women welcomed the change immediately, eager to return home, to walk familiar streets, and to embrace family members they had not seen in years. Others felt lost, unsure of who they were without the cockpit, the map, and the night sky above. The transition was not easy. Returning to civilian life after years of war demanded a kind of courage different from flying through flak. Many of the women were still in their early 20s, yet they had lived through experiences that set them apart from their peers. Their hands bore the calluses of mechanics, their eyes carried the weight of sleepless nights, and their hearts carried memories of friends who never came back. They struggled to explain their journey to those who had never heard the whistle of bombs or the hiss of gliding wings in the dark. For some, the regiment became their permanent family. The bonds forged in years of danger were not easily broken. Women who had shared cockpits, bunks and meals often stayed in contact long after the war. They visited one another, wrote letters, and reminded each other of the lives they had built on fragile wings. These connections became lifelines in a world that sometimes struggled to understand them. Recognition continued, though it often felt distant. Medals were pinned to uniforms, and ceremonies praised their service, but daily life rarely reflected that honour. Many returned to studies, becoming teachers, doctors, or engineers. A few continued to fly, determined to keep aviation as part of their lives. Yet in many cases their wartime service was tucked away in memory, overshadowed by the demands of rebuilding their country. Still, the legend endured. Stories of the Night Witches spread far beyond the Soviet Union, carried by whispers of their courage and by the fear they had inspired in the enemy. They became symbols of resilience, of how determination could turn fragile machines into instruments of war. For the women themselves, however, the story remained deeply personal. It was about nights spent in freezing cockpits, about the sound of engines sputtering back to life, about laughter shared before missions, and about the silence when friends did not return. In those memories, they carried both the pain and the pride of their service. Peace had come, but it was not the end of their story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where they would have to find themselves again, away from the war, away from the planes, but never away from the bond that had defined them. The years immediately after the war were filled with contrast for the women of the regiment. On the one hand, they returned home as decorated veterans, celebrated for their bravery and their role in victory. On the other, they faced the quiet reality that society was not always ready to recognise them as equals. Many were encouraged to set aside their military past, to marry, to raise families, and to return to ordinary lives. Yet for those who had flown thousands of missions, who had risked everything in fragile planes over enemy lines, there was nothing ordinary about who they had become. The transition into peace brought moments of joy. Families reunited, long-lost embraces were shared, and the sound of laughter returned to homes darkened by war. Some women stepped back into classrooms, resuming studies interrupted years earlier. Others began careers as engineers, doctors and teachers, eager to contribute to the rebuilding of their country. A few even remained in aviation, determined to keep the skies as part of their lives. But for many, the memories of the war lingered, woven into their daily existence. They remembered the freezing nights, the hiss of wind during silent glides, and the steady presence of comrades beside them. These recollections were both a source of pride and a shadow they could not shake. Some struggled with sleep, their minds replaying the glow of searchlights or the thunder of flak. Others carried physical reminders, frostbite scars, damaged hearing, or lingering pain from crashes. Yet through it all, the bond of the regiment endured. They wrote letters, visited each other, and gathered at reunions where laughter returned easily and stories flowed as though no time had passed. In those moments, they were not housewives or workers. They were pilots again, sharing memories of nights when the world depended on their fragile wings. Recognition grew slowly outside the Soviet Union. For years, the story of the Night Witches was little known beyond their homeland. Only later did their legend spread, carried in books, articles, and interviews that revealed how a group of young women had defied expectations and struck fear into one of the most powerful armies in history. To those who had lived it, the attention felt strange, almost unreal. They did not see themselves as legends, only as women who had answered a call. But the world began to see them as something more, symbols of resilience, courage, and the ability to endure against overwhelming odds. For the women themselves, the post-war years were a time of rebuilding, of rediscovering life beyond war, and of carrying forward the memories of those who did not return. They lived quietly, but within them remained the unshakable truth that in the darkest nights they had found the strength to shine. As the decades passed, the women of the regiment settled into lives that, on the surface, looked much like those of millions of others who had survived the war. They worked in offices, taught in schools, raised children, and carried the daily responsibilities of peace. Yet within them was a chapter of history few around them could truly imagine. When neighbours saw them in shops or on quiet walks, they did not see the pilots who once guided fragile biplanes through storms of fire. That part of their lives was hidden, known only to those who had flown beside them. The memories never faded. Each woman carried her own collection of moments, an endless night flight, a laugh shared before takeoff, the glow of flares in the distance. For some, these memories surfaced in dreams, both comforting and unsettling. They dreamed of the sky, of the freedom and fear that came together in every mission. They dreamed of comrades whose voices were forever silent, and though years softened the sharp edges of grief, the ache of loss never truly left them. Reunions became precious gatherings. Whenever possible, they met with former comrades, sharing tea, photographs, and the old stories that only they could understand. They spoke of the Po-2 planes with affection, recalling how those fragile machines had carried them through impossible odds. They laughed about makeshift repairs, about scarves that froze stiff in midair, about boots stuffed with straw to keep out the cold. And always, in their conversations, the names of the fallen were spoken with quiet reverence. The world beyond began to take more notice as time went on. Journalists, historians, and students sought out the women, eager to hear first-hand accounts of what it had been like to fly as a night witch. At first, many were shy to speak. They had not thought of themselves as extraordinary. But as they told their stories, they began to see how their experiences resonated, how their courage inspired new generations. The nickname that had once been an insult became a badge of honour they wore with quiet pride. Still, they remained humble. They insisted they had been no different from others who served, that they had simply done their duty. For them, the true heroes were those who had not come home. Each medal they had received felt less like a personal award and more like a tribute to friends who had given everything. As the years turned into decades, their legacy grew stronger. Schools taught about their missions, books carried their stories, and their images appeared in exhibitions. Children listened wide-eyed as aging women with soft voices described gliding silently through the night sky, bombs strapped to wings of wood and canvas. And while the world celebrated them as legends, the women themselves held on to a simple truth. They had been young once, uncertain and afraid, yet they had found courage together in the darkest nights of the war. By the 1960s, many of the women had grown older, their wartime service tucked quietly behind their everyday lives. They were mothers, grandmothers, professionals and retirees, but whenever they gathered, the old bonds returned instantly. At reunions, photographs of their younger selves in flight suits were passed around with laughter and tears. They remembered the icy runways, the long nights, and the quiet moments before takeoff when they leaned on each other for courage. For them, those years remained vivid, not as distant history, but as a part of who they were. Time, however, changed the way others saw them. The younger generations, born long after the war, often stared in amazement when they learned that these gentle, aging women had once flown in the dead of night against one of the most powerful armies in the world. Students asked them questions, pressing for details about how it felt to glide silently with engines off, or what they thought in those moments when searchlights swept across the sky. The women answered softly, careful with their words, balancing honesty with a calmness that matched the passing of years. They spoke not of glory but of responsibility, not of victory alone but of the cost that had come with it. recognition grew gradually. Books began to document their missions and articles praised their bravery. In public ceremonies, officials spoke of the Night Witches as national heroes, yet many of the women still felt modest, almost embarrassed by the attention. They insisted they had only done what was asked of them, that their actions were no greater than those of countless others who had fought and suffered. For them, the truest honour remained in the memory of their comrades who had not survived. At home, memories of the war were woven into their daily lives in quieter ways. Some kept medals tucked in drawers, only bringing them out for anniversaries. Others displayed faded photographs of crews standing beside battered planes, smiles on young faces despite exhaustion. A few still wrote down their recollections in journals, hoping their children or grandchildren would someday read and understand. And as years passed, the nickname Night Witches lost its sting, transforming fully into a symbol of pride. What had once been meant as an insult by enemies had become an emblem of courage, whispered now with admiration. The women grew older, but their story grew larger, spreading across borders and languages. To many around the world, they became more than a regiment. They became proof that even in the darkest hours of history, ordinary people could rise to extraordinary heights. For the women themselves, it remained simpler. They had been young, they had been afraid, and they had flown together into the night. As the women entered their later years, the regiment's story began to take on a life of its own, moving beyond the memories of those who had lived it. Historians published detailed accounts, filmmakers created documentaries, and schoolchildren learned about the Night Witches as part of their nation's past. For many of the surviving veterans, it felt surreal to see their faces in books or on screens, to hear their voices recorded and replayed for strangers. They were grateful that the story was being remembered, but they often reminded people that it was not about legends. It was about young women who had been ordinary, yet chose to do the extraordinary when history demanded it. Public recognition gave them opportunities to travel, to speak, and to share their experiences with audiences who had never known war. Some spoke at schools, describing in calm voices what it felt like to fly in planes made of wood and canvas, to cut engines and glide silently toward a target. Children listened with wide eyes, sometimes unable to believe that their soft-spoken grandmothers had once braved the skies under fire. These moments filled the veterans with quiet pride, though they never sought applause. They simply wanted the memory of their comrades and their sacrifices to endure. Time also brought challenges. The number of surviving Night Witches grew smaller each year, and with each passing, reunions became quieter, more precious. Those who remained spoke often of absent friends, recalling laughter in the barracks, whispered conversations before missions, and the silent glides that defined their nights. Grief remained, softened by decades but never erased. Yet alongside sorrow was gratitude, for the lives they had lived, for the chance to see peace last longer than war. International recognition also grew. Stories of the regiment appeared beyond the Soviet Union, reaching readers and listeners around the world. Foreign journalists described the Night Witches with awe, marvelling at how such fragile planes had carried such determination. For many, the regiment became a symbol of courage, not bound by nationality or politics, but by the universal strength of human spirit. In these later years, the veterans often reflected on what it all had meant. They spoke of fear, yes, but also of laughter, of hardship, but also of friendship. They remembered the cold and hunger, but more than anything they remembered each other, the bonds that had carried them through the darkest nights. To them, that bond was the real legacy, stronger even than the stories written in history books. As the world changed around them, they carried the unshakable truth that they had once soared together through fire and silence, and that their courage, stitched into history, would never be forgotten. By the 1970s and 1980s, the surviving Night Witches had become elderly women, but their memories remained sharp, carried in the quiet rhythm of their voices when they spoke of the past. Some were invited to military academies to share their experiences with young cadets, who listened with deep respect. Others preferred to stay out of the spotlight, keeping their stories within the family, passing them down to children and grandchildren who sometimes struggled to imagine their grandmothers flying fragile planes through storms of fire. The veterans often smiled at this disbelief, knowing that the distance of time made their youth seem like a tale rather than a lived reality. Life in the Soviet Union during those decades brought its own challenges, yet their wartime service gave them a perspective others did not always share. They had endured nights colder than any winter, hunger sharper than any rationing, and fear heavier than any political uncertainty. Because of that, many of them approached life's struggles with a calm steadiness. They were not easily shaken, for they had once faced searchlights and flak and survived. At reunions, the atmosphere was warm, filled with laughter and gentle teasing, as if they were young again. They reminisced about pranks pulled in the barracks, about mechanics who could fix anything with wire and determination, about songs sung quietly before missions. These gatherings were bittersweet. For each year there were fewer faces at the table. Still, they toasted the absent, raised glasses to the memory of those who had flown into the night and never returned. Recognition continued to grow internationally. Western journalists and historians discovered their story, publishing articles and even documentaries that introduced the world to these remarkable women. The veterans were surprised to receive letters from abroad, from people who thanked them for their courage. Some were moved to tears by the idea that their struggles, once hidden in darkness, were now lighting paths of inspiration for strangers far away. Yet through all the attention, they remained humble. They insisted they had been ordinary girls, many barely out of school, who simply answered the call of their country. The legend of the witches had been born from the whispers of enemies, but to them it was never about magic. It was about persistence, duty, and the strength found in sisterhood. As they aged, they often reflected on how fleeting youth had been. Photographs of them in flight suits, smiling beside their battered biplanes, seemed to show different people entirely. Yet when they looked at those images, they could still feel the cold wind on their cheeks, still hear the hum of the engine, still taste the silence of a night glide before bombs were released. Time had moved on, but memory kept those moments alive, etched not just in history, but in their very being. By the final decades of the 20th century, the Night Witches were seen less as former soldiers and more as living history. Schools invited them to speak on Victory Day, where children placed flowers in their hands and asked innocent questions about what it was like to fly through the night. The women answered patiently, their voices calm, though often they softened the harsher details, leaving the children with images of stars, engines, and courage rather than of fire and loss. For the veterans themselves, these ceremonies carried mixed emotions. They were proud to be remembered, yet every medal pinned to their coats felt heavier with the memory of comrades who had not lived to receive theirs. Their own lives had stretched into peace, but they never forgot those who had remained young forever, lost in the dark skies of war. Many of the women kept their wartime belongings carefully preserved. Scarves, maps, logbooks, or fragments of uniforms. Some placed these in museums, where strangers could study them behind glass. Others held them close at home, tucked into drawers, taken out only when memories grew too strong to ignore. These relics were not just objects, but pieces of themselves, anchors to a time when the world had depended on their courage. International recognition reached new heights during these years. Historians abroad began to publish works that highlighted the regiment's contribution, and documentaries brought their faces and voices to audiences far beyond their homeland. For many of the veterans, it was the first time they understood how deeply their story resonated across the world. Letters arrived from distant countries, written by people who had never known war yet felt inspired by the resilience of women who once flew in fragile planes. Despite the growing fame, the Night Witches themselves often downplayed their role. They repeated the same words again and again. We were just doing our duty. For them, the greatest pride was not in legend, but in the knowledge that they had protected their comrades on the ground, that their missions had mattered, and that their sacrifices had not been in vain. Their lives in peacetime remained humble. They lived in small apartments, rode trams, bought bread at markets, and blended into the rhythms of ordinary life. Yet whenever they gathered, the spark of youth returned. They laughed like they had in the barracks, teased one another about old habits, and for a few hours felt as though the years had not passed at all. In those reunions, they were not elderly veterans. They were still the women who had taken to the sky, guided by the stars and by each other. With every passing year, their numbers grew smaller, but their story grew larger. They understood now that their flights had become more than history. They had become a reminder to the world that even in the darkest nights, courage could shine brighter than fear. By the dawn of the 21st century, only a handful of the night witches remained alive, their hair silver, their voices softer, yet their memories as vivid as if the war had ended yesterday. They were invited to commemorations not just in their homeland but in other countries as well, where audiences rose to their feet in recognition of their extraordinary service. For the women, these ceremonies carried both pride and melancholy. Pride because their story had endured, no longer hidden in the shadows of history. Melancholy because so many of their sisters in arms were no longer there to stand beside them. Each time they pinned on their medals, they thought of the empty spaces beside them, of the bunks left unfilled so many years ago. Younger generations now saw them as living legends. Children and grandchildren looked at them with awe, teachers introduced them as heroes, and filmmakers captured their words for future archives. Often, the veterans smiled at this attention, though they repeated the same truth again and again. They had not thought of themselves as heroes. They had been girls, many barely out of school, who had done what needed to be done. The fact that they had frightened hardened soldiers and earned a place in military history seemed almost unbelievable to them even now. Despite their modesty, their legend continued to grow. Books were translated into many languages, films and plays dramatized their missions, and their nickname, once whispered as an insult, became a title of respect. Night Witches was now spoken with admiration, a phrase that carried the echo of silent glides and fearless determination. In their later years, many of the veterans found comfort in telling their stories. They described the cold, the hunger, the endless nights, but also the laughter, the songs, and the sisterhood that had carried them through. They spoke gently, never with bitterness, choosing to remember courage more than fear. For them, the greatest legacy was not the destruction they caused, but the bond they had forged, proof that in unity there was strength enough to face even the darkest nights. Everyday life for these aging women remained simple. They lived in small apartments, cooked meals for grandchildren, tended flowers on balconies. Neighbours might not guess that these quiet women had once flown through storms of flak, cutting engines and gliding silently toward enemy lines. Yet behind the ordinary rhythms of life was a history that could never be erased. And when anniversaries came, when the world paused to remember the Second World War, they stood proudly, frail but unbowed, living reminders of what had once been achieved with little more than canvas wings and unbreakable resolve. For the world, they had become symbols. For themselves, they remained what they had always been. Women who answered a call, who flew together into the night, and who carried one another through the fire until the dawn. As the years moved further into the new century, the night witches became fewer in number, yet their voices carried farther than ever before. Documentaries and books reached international audiences, making their story known not only to historians, but to ordinary people across the globe. Schools in countries far beyond Eastern Europe taught about the women who flew biplanes in the dead of night, dropping bombs with quiet precision and unmatched bravery. For the veterans still alive, it was strange to see their youthful faces printed in textbooks or projected on screens. They had once been just girls in oversized uniforms, pulling scarves tight against the cold, yet now they were remembered as timeless figures of courage. Public interest often brought them to interviews, where reporters asked the same questions again and again. Were you afraid? How did you endure? What was it like to glide silently above the enemy? Their answers never changed. They admitted to fear, but they spoke more about trust. Trust in their comrades, in their mechanics, and in the rhythm of the sky itself. They emphasized not their own bravery, but the shared bond that allowed them to climb back into cockpits night after night. To them, courage had not been the absence of fear, but the decision to fly despite it. Aging brought with it the weight of memory. The veterans often found themselves reflecting late at night, recalling the hiss of the wind when engines were cut, the sharp glow of searchlights, the sight of forests rushing beneath fragile wings. They remembered the laughter of comrades, the songs sung softly before missions, and the silence that followed when friends did not return. These memories, though painful, remained precious. They were proof of lives lived intensely, of moments that had shaped them forever. Recognition came in new forms as well. Some women received letters from young pilots, especially women, who saw them as pioneers and role models. They were thanked for breaking barriers, for proving that the sky belonged not only to men, but to anyone with the will to fly. These messages touched them deeply, for they had never thought of themselves as revolutionaries, only as soldiers answering a call. In everyday life, they remained humble. They watered plants on balconies, told bedtime stories to grandchildren, and moved slowly through city streets. Passers-by might not recognize them, but history had etched their names into permanence. Each anniversary of the war brought ceremonies where their faces were honoured with applause, and though they stood frail with age, the spark of pride still shone in their eyes. They knew their numbers would continue to dwindle, but they also knew their story would not vanish. It had become part of something larger, a testament to resilience, sacrifice, and the unshakable strength of the human spirit. In this way, even as time thinned their ranks, the Night Witches soared on, not in planes of wood and canvas, but in memory, carried by generations who would never forget their flight through history's darkest skies. By the 2010s, only a handful of the Night Witches were still alive, their numbers dwindling with each passing year. Yet their story had reached a kind of immortality, carried not only in books and films, but in the hearts of people across the world. They were invited to ceremonies where entire audiences rose in standing ovations, honouring women who had once been little more than shadows in the night sky. For the surviving veterans, these moments were humbling. They often looked at the applause with soft smiles, whispering to each other that they had simply done their duty. In their minds, the true heroes were still those who had not come home. The veterans often lived quietly in modest apartments, surrounded by mementos of long lives, photographs, medals in faded cases, and sometimes a carefully folded uniform tucked away in a drawer. Neighbours might see them as ordinary grandmothers, but the world knew better. These were women who had defied expectations, who had guided fragile planes through storms of fire and returned again and again. Their presence at public events reminded everyone that history was not only written in books but lived in the faces of those still among us. Interviews grew more poignant as time went on. With voices weakened by age but sharpened by memory, they described nights of silence in the cockpit, the sting of frost on bare skin, and the strange mix of fear and calm as bombs were released over enemy lines. They spoke not of hatred but of endurance, not of vengeance but of necessity. When asked how they wanted to be remembered, many answered simply, as women who did what had to be done. Younger generations found inspiration in their words. Pilots, especially women entering aviation, looked to the Night Witches as pioneers. Their story became part of broader discussions about equality, resilience, and the power of determination. To young dreamers who gazed at the sky, these veterans proved that courage could take flight on even the most fragile of wings. In their later years, the veterans sometimes gathered in small groups, fewer each time. They drank tea, told the same stories, laughed at the same old jokes, and sat in quiet remembrance of those missing from the table. The bond remained unbroken, even as time thinned their ranks. Every smile, every tear, every memory shared was a reminder that their sisterhood had outlasted war and endured into peace. By now, the Night Witches were more than history. They had become symbols, their story transcending borders and generations. They were proof that courage could be found in unlikely places, that determination could outlast despair, and that even the smallest wings could help change the course of history. Though frail in body, they remained unshakable in spirit, carrying forward the quiet pride of having flown into the night when the world needed them most. In the present day, the legacy of the Night Witches lives on, even as the last survivors fade into history. Museums across Europe and beyond display their photographs, their uniforms, and the fragile Polikarpov Po-2 planes that once carried them through the night. Visitors stand before these exhibits in awe, marveling at how such simple machines could strike fear into hardened soldiers. Guides tell the story softly, how young women, many still teenagers, took flight against overwhelming odds, and how their courage became a legend whispered by enemies and cherished by allies. The women themselves, those who remain, are now nearly a century old. Their voices are gentle but steady, their eyes clouded by age yet still bright when they recall the past. They speak not of anger, but of endurance. They remember the cold, the hunger, and the exhaustion. But more than anything, they remember laughter in the barracks, whispered promises before takeoff, and the bond that tied them together through the darkest nights. Each year, on anniversaries of victory, wreaths are laid and candles lit in their honour. Young cadets salute their memory, school children recite their names, and families bring flowers to monuments where their story is engraved in stone. Across borders and generations, the Night Witches have become a symbol of resilience, a reminder that courage can come in the most unexpected forms. Their legend also continues in the skies. Modern female pilots often cite the Night Witches as inspiration, proof that the barriers of gender can be broken, and that determination is as powerful as any machine. Flight schools tell their story to students, weaving history into the dreams of those who still look upward. For the world, the Night Witches are heroes. For themselves, they always insisted they were simply women who answered a call. They did not see themselves as extraordinary, only as soldiers who stood when needed. Yet history has given them a place far greater than they ever sought. Their fragile biplanes may no longer fly, but their story soars higher than ever, carried on wings of memory. In the quiet of today's peaceful nights, when stars stretch endlessly across the sky, one can still imagine the faint hiss of gliding wings, the whisper of engines cut in silence, and the courage of women who flew into darkness to bring the dawn closer. The Night Witches are no longer just a regiment. They are a timeless reminder that even in the blackest hours, human spirit can rise, fragile yet unbreakable, to light the path of history.